So we will kind of cover the next half of this. And this lecture is going to be really focused on fear in particular. That's something that's really well studied in Cogneuro. And then we'll kind of get into some of the other emotions at the end of the lecture. Today we're going to keep kind of exploring these emotional processes. And we're going to start with theories about how these emotions are kind of generated or created in the first place. And there's, if you guys have read the book, they went through like 8 different theories in a row. And I was like, there's no way you guys have like the working memory capacity to keep like 8 different theories in mind. So we're going to explore kind of the main ones that the field has been focusing on and how they tie to the brain stuff. And then we're going to kind of explore how these different emotional processes can affect the memory processes that we've already talked about. And then look kind of at the end about how it affects these other cognitive functions as well. So we'll get into first theories of how they're created in the first place. And there's a lot of debate. This topic has evolved a lot throughout the last 100 years or so when William James really started to look at a lot of this. But we're going to start with kind of a little demonstration. So imagine you guys wake up and it's a really nice day. And so you and your friend decide to go for a hike. You're walking through the woods. It's a really nice sunny day. You feel the sun beating down on you. It's warm. You smell all of these really nice smells out on this Oregon Trail. Kind of wind your way through. There's flowers and everything. It's really nice. You feel euphoric and happy as you're hiking through the woods. And you come across this nice little stream. It's a hot day. You dip your hands in. You love the feeling of the cold water on your hands. And you turn around and all of a sudden you see this. Right? And like all of those happy feelings start to fade away. And you start to feel very different than you did a second ago. And you're like, hey, Mr. Bear, like, we're cool. Don't mind me. And the bear's like, right? And you, at this moment, decide to run away. Because you know that you don't need to outrun the bear. You just need to outrun your friend, right? But this whole scenario, we're going to use this as kind of a framework for trying to understand these theories of emotion generation. And a lot of them are tied to this idea of fear. And fear is something that is very heavily studied in cognitive neuroscience. It's something that's easy to study because we can invoke it in humans, we can invoke it in animals. So when we're thinking about emotion, we're kind of going through this lecture, a lot of the stuff's going to be tied to fear. And a lot of it's tied to kind of what we were discussing in the last lecture about what the emotion actually is. Is the emotion all of these physiological responses that you're having, right? Your heart beating, your muscles starting to tense up, and all of this resource allocation going into this fight or flight mode. Is this the actual emotion, or do we feel all of this and then decide what the emotion is later? And that's kind of what we're going to get into. And the first theory that we're going to look at is the James Lange theory. So this was William James that we talked about, who was kind of in opposition to Darwin. He was kind of along this line of saying that there's not these like universal core emotions that are hardwired. And his idea was that emotions are perceptions, these like subjective accounts that we have of them, and they're created to interpret the feelings that are coming from the body. And so James Lange's kind of interpretation of this, or not James, that was 2 different people, William James and his partner, Lange, were under this kind of assumption that what happens is that we see the bear and we automatically go into this fight or flight mode. All of that physiological stuff starts happening and our fight or flight responses start to tell us that we need to run. Adrenaline's released, heart rate starts going up, all this kind of stuff. Behavioral response, we start running. And then after the fact, so we don't run from the bear because we're afraid, we ran and then we felt afraid later. And the idea is that we feel all those physiological reactions happening, and then we label those physiological reactions as fear. So it's this pattern of responses from our body that indicates what emotion we're actually feeling. And he had this nice quote here. He said, if the emotions came before the bodily states, and so if we have this perception, if we see the bear and we decide we're afraid, then they would be purely cognitive. They'd be pale and colorless and destitute of emotional warmth. That's not how emotions feel, right? We have this kind of innate sense that emotions do feel like something. And so his argument is that the actual labeling of the emotion comes after we feel all of those things. And so what he was kind of arguing for was that there's this dependence on feedback, right? And so you have the sense organ, so you have all of these kind of sensory modalities that are bringing in all this information. You're seeing the bear, and those are creating command to go into fight or flight. So all of that sensory information is kind of being integrated and understood in a really fast manner, and that's sending all of these signals to get ready, to start running. And then once the muscles and all the viscera, all of your organs and all that stuff, once they send feedback to the cortex, like, okay, we're in fight or flight mode, that's when the interpretation happens. That's when the emotion labeling happens, according to the James Lang theory. So early on, there were some researchers that started to look at how there could be some problems with this theory, because there could be cases where we have emotions that don't really rely on the physiological sensation. And there was another group at the time. This was, I brought these two theories up because they were really kind of the big debate at the beginning of this kind of talk about emotion generation. And this other group, Cannon and Bard, did this test. I feel so bad for these cats. We talked about so many, anyway. So they severed the cortex of the cat from the sensory input that was coming from the thalamus and the hypothalamus. And so this cat was unable to get any of that feedback from the body, was unable to understand what the body actually felt like, what kind of physiological reactions were happening. And what they were trying to show was that the animal could still experience an emotion without all of that physiological feedback. And what they did is they put this cat that didn't have any of that sensory information coming in, they put it in with a dog, and the cat still had this emotional, anger reaction. It bowed up at the dog, it growled, it bared its teeth, the hair was standing on end, and all of this stuff. And Cannon and Bard argued that this was an emotion. This was an emotion that didn't involve cognition, that didn't involve any of the physiological feedback. This whole study has been replicated in a bunch of other species, but there are still some things kind of intuitively that I think about that's a little bit wrong with this. And a lot of it kind of ties back to what we were talking about in the last lecture about the definition of emotion not being really firm, right? Is this whole reaction actually an emotion, or is the emotion something that's a perception, that's created, that's cognitive? And so that's still kind of fuzzy, but Cannon and Bard, this was kind of their idea, that they kind of believed that our physiological sensations were not distinct enough. They were not, we have very similar type of fight or flight responses to different types of stimuli that end up being different things, like fear and anger can kind of feel very similar. There was this idea that there was this simultaneous processing of both the emotional reactions, all the physiological stuff, and the cognitive portion of it, the cognitive, creating the emotion and all that kind of stuff. So they believed that these things were happening in parallel, that the thalamus was sending a signal to the cortex to kind of make sense of the situation, and it was also sending a signal to the hypothalamus to kind of activate those physiological responses. And that's kind of what you guys are getting at, that there is these hardwired things that are responsible for that emotion happening in the first place. And so the cortex is generating a feeling, and the peripheral nervous system is kind of carrying out the entire reaction. And so this was the big thing here is this first point, is that really sets it apart from the James Lang theory, was that James Lang thought that there was a very specific physiological feeling that tied to every emotion. And they're saying there's way too many emotions for there to be a specific physiological reaction that describes every single one of those emotions. And what we end up seeing is that as this kind of debate started to play out, as more kind of data rolled in, we started to see that the cognitive portion of this is a lot more complex, and that there's a lot of nuance to the feeling itself, the cognitive portion of this, that has a lot to do with significance, right? Weighing harm and benefit, weighing considerations of your goals and your intentions, all of these personal things, weighing what the environmental variables at that particular time are. And if these things are even just a little bit different, then two people that have the same emotion are going to come to a different meaning of that emotion. They're going to label it a little bit different. And so they started to say that there's this significance portion to the emotion as well that ties into kind of the emergence and the labeling of it. And this really kind of helped to tie into this next theory. It really started to put these two James Lang and Cannon Barth theories together and to kind of find that there was some common ground between the two of them. And this was a really interesting study. I don't know what the IRB would say about this today. So they brought these subjects in and they gave them a shot of adrenaline. And half of the participants, they actually told them, I just gave you a shot of adrenaline. This is what adrenaline does. It's going to make you fidgety. It's going to make you like really hyped up, all of these things, right? The other half was told that it was a shot of vitamins, even though it was a shot of adrenaline. Right? Each of these participants was put in a room with a confederate. A confederate is just someone that works for the study that they think is another participant. And so they put them in this room and they had them just interact with this person. And this confederate was instructed to either act kind of euphoric, to talk about how happy they were and how amazing things were and how just like everything was great. And in another group of people, they were supposed to just act angry, kind of caustic, try to really bring the mood down, all of those things. And afterwards, they asked the participants how they felt after this conversation. And what they found was that the group that knew that they had a shot of adrenaline attributed everything that they felt to the adrenaline. So if they felt euphoric, if they felt angry, whatever, it was, they labeled it that it was the adrenaline that was doing that. The other group that didn't know that they had adrenaline, they might have been feeling euphoric because of the adrenaline. They might have been feeling agitated and angry because of the adrenaline, but they attributed everything they felt to the person that was in the room, right? So these two people experiencing very similar emotions came to very different labels based on what they knew, what kind of considerations came in. And so we have Singer and Schachter, they're the ones that put on this study. They kind of agreed with James that emotions involve this interpretation of the bodily states, right? That's kind of what we just saw in that adrenaline study, that they were trying to understand why it was that their body was doing what it was doing. They were trying to label what that feeling actually was. But they also kind of agreed with Cannon and Barth that there were way too many emotions for there to be like a specific physiological reaction to every single one of them. And so how they kind of put this together was that they said that you have this emotional arousal, you have this physiological reaction that's happening, and then you kind of take a step to reason, to try to figure out what that physiological thing means. It's not that that physiological reaction means happiness, it's that you have that physiological reaction, you look around at the environment that you're in, the people you're interacting with, and you try to say, okay, because I'm in this situation that's very positive, there's positive environmental factors, there's positive people, I'm going to label this thing as happy. And so there's this cognitive portion of it where they're trying to label the physiological responses instead of that physiological response just automatically labeling it. So it requires this kind of appraisal portion of deciding the significance of that. And then afterwards, we decide, yeah, this is fear. I'm running away from the bear now. But it involved this like, okay, I'm feeling very anxious. My fight or flight mechanism is kicking in. I'm in an environment where I see a big brown bear in front of me. Those two things together have created this cognitive label of fear that now I'm like, okay, this is fear. I'm running away. So it kind of puts these two things together. And this was kind of really at the beginning of getting into the cognitive neuro side of things and getting into how the brain works. And Ledoux kind of started to look at this from a mechanistic standpoint of what's going on in the brain that's actually causing all of this stuff. And he proposed this high and low roads or slow and fast roads idea, where he said there's probably two paths of information that are happening in parallel that are contributing to both the physiological component of this and the cognitive label component of this. And so the low road was one that he thought we have this sensory information coming in. That sensory information is going directly to portions of the brain that are activating the physiological responses. So it's bypassing the cortex, it's going straight to the amygdala. The amygdala is the one that's kind of jump-starting the fight or flight stuff. The high road is a lot slower. It involves the building of perceptions that we've talked about throughout the class. And so the sensory information comes in, it goes to the cortex, it spends time going through all of those different regions that we've talked about, comparing it to things that we've seen before in our medial temporal lobe, and then eventually kind of labeling that. And so this eventually catches up with the physiological stuff and kind of incorporates that into it. And I have another slide. The next one is going to get more into the actual kind of pathways in the brain, but it's the exact same information. So don't worry about like the notes on this one, because this is saying the exact same thing. It just has a nice picture to kind of look at this. So, so this is what they were talking about. That there's these simultaneous pathways. So the low road. So we have the thalamus right here, where all of our sensory information goes to first. And the thalamus will send that information to two different regions. The low road, the fast one, goes straight to the amygdala. And the information that the amygdala is getting is crude. It's not really well processed. The amygdala is using its dense connections to the hippocampus. It's like right next to the hippocampus to try to compare that really crude information to things we've seen before and decide whether it's something we should be afraid of. But the amygdala, as we'll see throughout the lecture, is really, really tied into the physiological side of things. It has dense connections to the hypothalamus. So this one is the really fast one because it's not being processed. The high road, instead of going to the amygdala first, it goes to the cortex. So it goes to the back of the brain back here where the visual cortex is. It goes through ventral and dorsal processing streams. And eventually that information also gets back to the amygdala and helps it kind of complete the picture. And so this is the idea that like there is this cognitive portion going on, this appraisal process of like identifying things, comparing it to things that we've seen before, but there's also this really fast pathway. And it allows us to be really flexible, right? We want to be able to make really snap and quick decisions. And it's okay if we make low risk mistakes, right? Where it's like we jump to something that's not really a risk. But the reason that circuitry is in place is because we also don't want to make high risk mistakes, right? You want to have a really quick response in case that thing actually is a high risk, and then you just save yourself. Because if you miss a high risk one, you're kind of game over. So, so this kind of started a lot of the research into the amygdala, and this is kind of something that's replicated a lot, that a lot of researchers are kind of tying into now. There are other theories in the book if you guys are interested to get into like the evolutionary perspective and things like that. But this is kind of the end of those that we're going to talk about today. And we'll kind of jump into the amygdala itself. So the amygdala is the most connected structure in the forebrain. I don't want you guys to memorize the different subregions that I'm about to list here. If you guys take anything from this slide, just take the fact that it is a very, very connected structure. And it has this lateral portion that receives a bunch of sensory input from the thalamus. And this lateral portion outputs to kind of this basal portion that sends signals to the basal ganglia. So this initiates the really, really quick action responses of like, something's wrong, we gotta act, we gotta do it now. You know, the central medial portion, that's really heavily connected to the hypothalamus. And so this starts to kick in all of the hormone changes that start the fight or flight responses. And then you have the cortical nucleus that's really heavily tied to olfactory bulb, the orbital frontal cortex, and it's also really, really tied to the hippocampus. And so we'll see kind of later in this lecture that there are a lot of modulatory effects that the amygdala has on our ability to lay down memories. There are a lot of researchers that, because this thing is really, really well connected, that think that this isn't actually a brain region, but it's just projections from these other regions that are kind of crossing through that area. Interesting idea. And it's been really hard for researchers to kind of separate this out and call it one thing, because there's these very distinct regions that do very distinct things. And because of those connections that it has to the hypothalamus to kickstart the physiological stuff, and it's access to kind of that early sensory information to do kind of really quick movements. A lot of people think that the amygdala is a protective structure that evolved to allow us to avoid dangerous situations and to recognize those really, really quickly. And a lot of that involves that it's involved in the identification process, and not just the identification process, but using that identification to kind of create a plan of what we should do about it. And so there's a lot of connections to these other things that we've talked about, attention and perception. We haven't really got into value representation and decision making. We'll get into that next week. But because of all of these dense connections that it has to all these different regions, there are a lot of people that think that it's kind of coordinating the activity between them until it comes to kind of a unique decision about what all of those different things have to say. And it kind of sends signals to these other parts until the issue has been figured out, until there's an action plan kind of that's been initiated. So something that I'm really gonna want you to know is that it's heavily involved in danger. That's gonna be pretty obvious because we're talking a bunch about fear. But this whole like underlining the what here is that it's not just involved in recognizing danger, but it's really heavily involved in actually coming up with a plan about what to do about it. And this is like so interesting. So I kind of hinted at this, hinted at it in the last lecture. This kind of gets into the amygdala lesions that we're going to talk about. So damage to the amygdala results in a lack of fear completely. And they have these monkeys that have lesions to the amygdala that are just like super bold. Will just like walk right up to this cobra and be like, "What's up, buddy?" And they will keep doing that. They'll keep trusting people, trusting strangers, and all of these things. Even if this guy gets bit by this snake, they'll still try to be its friend. Like, "It's okay, buddy. I still like you." Very, very incautious, very overly trusting. And so this really kind of tied into that idea that the amygdala is kind of protecting us from things that are potentially dangerous and things that we should avoid. And there was this patient SM, that had bilateral amygdala damage and removal. And this is the one that I've been hinting at for a couple lectures. And she was completely unable to identify the emotion of fear on people's faces, which was really interesting because she could identify all of the other emotions. It was very specific to identifying if a face was fearful or not, which was really interesting. She fails to experience fear at all, so she doesn't have physiological responses that are linked to the fear response. And she has this inability to learn from past fear. I have this picture up here. Sorry to have like a gun pointed at your face. But she had been held at knife point multiple times, been held at gunpoint multiple times, been in a bunch of fights and been accosted by people. And she kept putting herself into these situations. I mean, that like baffled me because even if I did have amygdala damage, like, where are you going to get put into gunpoint like 3 times? Like, what do you do? That was interesting. But the kind of takeaway from here is that without this amygdala, she had no kind of plan. She had nothing to do about those fear responses, and she didn't learn from any of them. And so a lot of these researchers that studied her, because of course, like if someone's got these really amazing behavioral features, then they're going to get bombarded by psychologists that want to study them. They kind of concluded what we've been talking about, that the amygdala is really, really heavily involved in not only recognizing fear, but also in kind of initiating that response. And so they think that it kind of builds perceptions of fearful stimuli. So kind of tags something as important and tags it as something that we should be weary of. And then it coordinates the entire physiological action to actually initiate the physical response. So that's kind of end of like emotion generation. This stuff will tie in though, because now we're going to kind of look at how emotion is impacting these other things that we've already learned about. And so we'll start with kind of its impact on the medial temporal lobe. It involves hippocampus and all that kind of stuff. And the amygdala is really, really well positioned right at the end of the hippocampus. So it's tied into all of those different processes that we talked about in learning memory lectures. And it's really interesting. So we were, like Lewis was saying, we're really tied into a lot of fear responses that are innate, where we can fear things that we've never seen before. But we're also really, really good at learning to fear things. So much so that we can fear things that we've never seen or never exist. So most animals require that they experience something aversive to learn that that's something that they should fear. But we're able to kind of build these like complex perceptions, right? So the amygdala has these really dense connections to the hippocampus. And so if we're talking about these monsters that exist and these aliens or whatever, we're forming very detailed perceptions of those. And those perceptions are being saved by the hippocampus in long-term memory. And the amygdala has access to all of that, and it's able to pick up on that. And so in the middle of the night, when you hear a bump and you've learned that there's an association between a bump in the night and a monster under the bed, it's immediately what you go to. So really, really interesting feature of human cognition. There could be something like this in lower animals. They can't tell us about the monsters they're afraid of, so we don't really know. But this is a really interesting kind of fact about humans. So, I mean, if you're going to take something from this slide, just the idea that we can fear things that we've never seen before, and that's something that's kind of uniquely human. This study, I feel like we'll get into it. Okay. So this researcher was working with this patient that had Korsakoff syndrome. So they had hippocampal damage. They were unable to form new memories. So they had anterograde amnesia. And every day he would come into this room, he would greet this woman, he'd shake her hand, and every day that was the first time that woman had ever shook his hand. Just like, oh, nice to meet you, my name's so-and-so, whatever, right? So wasn't able to remember that she shook this guy's hand the day before. This is where I was kind of laughing a second ago, because it's just like, this seems like a cruel joke. So one day he went in with a pin in his hand and poked her when he was shaking her hand. It was like, yeah, she's not going to remember this. I'm just going to poke her hand. I really hope that there was like a whole research plan involved with this, and that it wasn't just something that he was doing to mess with her. But we learned something really important from this. So he shook her hand, he had a pin in his hand, and he poked her when he did it. And she withdrew. It was this aversive event, hurt her. And because of that, the next day, she didn't remember him, but she wouldn't shake his hand. And so it was this idea that there's this other process that's kind of outside of the hippocampus, outside of the medial temporal lobe, that's still laying down these emotional implicit memories that allow us to kind of learn these associations without having to kind of cognitively label them and add context to them. And it kind of ties into this idea of fear conditioning. So this is something that's really, really heavily done in the animal world to try to figure out how these different wiring pathways work. And so you have this rat that sees a light. There's no response to the light. This is going to be the conditioned stimulus. You then shock the rat. So this is the unconditioned stimulus. That shock is going to cause the rat to have a startle response. You have a loud noise that will cause a startle response as well, but then you pair the light up with the shock, and now just showing the light makes the rat jump. And you can also pair the light with sound and make the rat jump as well. The whole idea behind this is that there's this associative type of process going on that's allowing emotional memories to kind of lay down a framework for aversive things. So you have this aversive stimulus that's paired with a neutral stimulus, and then the rat will eventually just respond to the light, even though the light doesn't actually hurt it. And this was something that was really interesting, was that the rats that have amygdala damage are not able to form this association. So it didn't have anything to do with the hippocampus. Like the hippocampus is really important in kind of binding information and things like that. But this startle response, this physiological response, the woman pulling her hand back, was something that was being coordinated by a different mechanism than what we talked about with memory itself. So this was kind of just a nice kind of animal model that gets a very similar idea. And that's the amygdala is very, very tied into that whole relationship. So they did this study with patient SP, who was just like SM that we talked about earlier, that had bilateral amygdala lesions. And they showed her this blue square, and they kind of paired it, like we were just talking about with the rat study, to an electric shock. And what happens with normal, healthy participants is that when they see, so after this has already been conditioned, so they know that the blue square is going to result in a shock, the normal patients will have a galvanic skin response. And so this is your sweat glands start to release stuff. It's kind of this anticipatory, you know that something's coming. This is what they use. This is one of the measures they use for lie detection. And you have the blue square. They know they're about to be shocked, so they get kind of hyped up. You have this physiological reaction that starts opening up the sweat glands, and then they get shocked. And what we saw was that without the amygdala, this patient SP, even though they knew that these two things were linked, they could tell us, like, I knew that the blue square was going to result in a shock, even though they knew the body wasn't creating that physiological response, wasn't creating that kind of anticipatory physiological fear response. So that's kind of takeaway from this slide, is that the amygdala is really, really heavily tied into actually producing the hormonal type cascade that creates all of those physiological responses. Look at this guy. Big old pub. Learning fear is something, this is what I was just talking about with Lewis before we got here, is something that we don't have to experience. So we can learn it through secondhand knowledge, like we were just talking about. So I can hear a story from a friend about a dog that bit them, and just by hearing that story, I can develop this entire fear kind of perception, this entire fear response. And I don't have the response when I'm hearing the story. I'm not afraid when she's telling me about the dog bite, but when I see a dog in the future, all of that is now hardwired. And now I have this fear response that was created completely from this secondhand knowledge. It didn't require any type of aversive stimuli that I had to encounter myself. It was all based on this just secondhand story that was told to me. And like Lewis was saying, this is very, very adaptive for survival type evolutionary processes. And this is something that makes the human species really, really successful, is that we're able to not have to go through something that could potentially kill us because we can just ask somebody about it. Kind of important. But it's really interesting because this will kind of lead into kind of the second point on this next slide about kind of exposure therapy type stuff. So the first thing I want to go through is this point here. So they did that same experiment I was just showing you guys with the blue square and the shock. But this time, they actually told the participants before they even started that the blue square means you're going to get shocked. And so it was this explicit kind of secondhand description of what was going to happen. And so they had already learned to fear the blue square before they ever were conditioned, right? And the control patients showed a skin response. So they'd never experienced the shock, but they still had this whole physiological response already prepared for it. And the lesion patients didn't have the response at all. So even though they knew that it was going to happen, there was nothing to actually initiate all that stuff. But something that they kind of found throughout these studies that was really interesting was that if you tell them that the blue square is bad, and then you don't actually pair the blue square with a shock, that they will learn to not fear the blue square, and that physiological response will go away. And so if you then give this big old dog a hug, you realize he's not that bad, then you can learn to not fear them. And this is something like a big driver of exposure therapy. People that have really bad phobias, if you get them to actually experience those things and to see that there's not an aversive conditioned response that comes out of it, that they can learn to kind of extinct that stuff. Flashbulb memories are a really kind of interesting way that show that the amygdala is kind of enhancing what the medial temporal lobe is doing in the first place. So flashbulb memories are autobiographical memories that are linked to public events, and these make them really easy to study. So these types of memories aren't just linked to public events, but the ones that are linked to public events, we can ask a bunch of different people about their experience, about where they were when, say, 9/11 was happening. And what we find is that there's a ton of contextual detail that people kind of maintain about these really big world events. And so like I can tell you, I was in 3rd grade, I can tell you exactly what the house looked like that morning, what the hallways in the school were like. I remember a ton of contextual details. And it's really important that it's not memory about the event. It's not the actual thing that happened. It's memory for what you were doing and what was around you and what it felt like. And what we see is that for normal autobiographical memories, a lot of those contextual details will degrade over time, but they've shown that for these flashbulb memories that's not the case, that we still maintain these really heavy contextual details. I had a situation in 5th grade. I had a girl next to me have a seizure. And to this day, I still remember exactly what she was wearing. She was wearing a gray shirt that said "cute" in rhinestones, like the way she looked at me. Like we were reading a book about exploration of Antarctica. I can tell you exactly what the cover of that book looked like. Just so happened I had a crush on the girl. I think that my elementary school crush. But yeah, it's kind of amazing that when we're in these stressful situations, there's something about the brain that recognizes this is important for future things that might happen. And so you end up laying down a ton more contextual detail. There was a really cool study that was done by David Eagleman. He was looking at time perception, and he was kind of making this distinction of like, he remembered falling off of a roof when he was a kid. And he was like, I remember seeing like every detail of those falling, all these bricks and everything. And so he was wondering, can we slow down time? Does our brain in these really stressful situations actually slow down time? And so he did this study where he was pushing people off of this huge tower that was at an old amusement park. So they fell like 3 stories into a net. And he had this watch on that had numbers that were going really, really fast. So you couldn't see the numbers. And his whole idea was like, if they really slow down time, they should be able to see the numbers and they should be able to report them when they get to the bottom. And he found that they didn't slow down time, but when he interviewed them about the whole experience, they had way more contextual details. And so it feels like we're experiencing a slowdown of time because we're just recording way more information for future stuff. God, that would be such a fun study. Anyway, so this kind of ties into these enhancement effects, and we see this with arousal in general. Arousal in general is something that really kicks all of this stuff up, really enhances this stuff. So they had these rats that they would inject with some type of drug that increased their arousal, or they would put them through some kind of physical stressor that would really get their arousal up, and it made them better at figuring out the Morse water maze. And rats with the amygdala damage were not impaired at the learning of the maze. So it's not necessary for forming the memory itself, but it does help for kind of enhancing the memory. And so the ones with the amygdala damage didn't have enhanced memory, but they still were able to solve the maze. So it showed that the amygdala wasn't necessary for actually forming the memory and how to solve it and all that stuff, but it was important in kind of boosting it and enhancing the abilities. And this was really cool. They showed that if the rat learned the maze and then they stressed it afterwards, that it retroactively boosted the memory. And so all of that information about the maze was still kind of in that consolidation period. And so it boosted everything that had just been done. And there was this study that was done on humans that kind of looked at that effect of like what happens afterwards. So they showed all these participants images from 2 different categories. So it was animals and tools. And they showed them a bunch at the beginning. So they had them, they said, I want you to remember all of these images. So they showed them a bunch of animals. They showed them a bunch of tools. And then they put them into a second phase of the experiment where they then paired the shock with one of those categories. And they found that the participants had better memory for the items that were paired with shock. So they remembered the hammer better, they remembered this magnet better, but they also found that they had better memory for items of the same category they had learned at the beginning of the experiment. And so the arousal itself had kind of tagged that whole category as being important and retroactively like So it was this idea of inconsequential information can kind of retroactively be tagged. And so it's this idea that like you learn that the shock is paired with the tools. And so you've already learned all these tools, and all those tools are kind of still sitting there in the consolidation process. And so it's like, well, those are important too, because those are now linked to this aversive event, and those need to be boosted. And so this kind of gets at what I had highlighted on that last slide. So something important to remember is that this whole arousal enhancement effect can happen to stuff that you've already learned before the arousal even happened. It can happen kind of retroactively. And this was a picture from one of our earlier studies when we were doing learning and memory. This is what I did my master's work on. And it was what we were just getting at with Lewis. So these low levels of arousal have been linked to these enhancement effects. And it could be, like Josh was saying, that it may be tied more to the norepinephrine. I've actually seen stuff from Marcia Mather that has this whole gain model that shows how norepinephrine can actually boost glutamate signals. And so it makes things a lot like higher in activity. But once you reach a certain level of arousal, once you reach a certain level of stress, you have all of this cortisol in the bloodstream. The hippocampus is actually packed with glucocorticoid receptors. I mean, glucocorticoid is a stress hormone, so mostly cortisol, but it's also kind of a category of other stress hormones. And once the hippocampus is kind of inundated or covered in these glucocorticoids, it really shuts that hippocampal function down. And it makes it so that you're not able to lay down like long-term contextual memories. There's a really cool paper that I really liked in my master's degree that talked about PTSD and about how people with PTSD are still laying down memories. And that's kind of what we talked about earlier, that without the hippocampus, you can still form these emotional type memories. And that because they didn't have the hippocampus on when those memories were formed, there's no way to just like retrieve them. There's no contextual tag that they can like think up of and like bring it up to mind. And because of that, they're never able to face them. And so the only thing that ever bring those memories up are stimulus triggers, like the fan spinning, and it's like helicopter blades, and all of a sudden, all of those physiological responses, all of those memories start just flooding them. So really interesting idea that there's like these different forms of memory that are stored in different ways, and they can be accessed in different ways, and that without the context, you can't really bring it to the surface and face it. So we'll get into now how emotion, so we just talked a lot about memory, but emotion affects everything. It affects all of these different cognitive processes that we've talked about throughout the class. It really modulates the way that they work. So the first one we'll talk about is attention. And I really want to get to the last couple of slides, so I might skip a couple. We'll see how we're going on time. So the attentional blink was a study where you show a bunch of different stimuli really, really fast. So this is 100 milliseconds. So these are just like super rapid. And it's so rapid that it's really hard to identify any one particular item. But what they found was that if you tell them, I want you to ignore all the numbers and I want you to pay attention to letters. So if you see a letter, I want you to remember what that letter is. If they're told to pay attention to one, they can identify it. Right? So you're ignoring all of these other ones, and then all of a sudden an F comes up, and you're like, okay, I saw an F, right? And then another one comes up, and you're like, oh, okay, I saw a K. And at the end, they're going to ask you what was the first letter and what was the last letter, or what was the second letter, what was the second target. Attentional blink is this idea that if these two targets, if the F and the K are too close to one another in time, so if they happen really rapidly, you're going to miss the second one. That's like the blink. You're focused on the F, the K is happening too soon. That's what this graph right here is showing. That like if it happens right after the K, you can usually catch it. But if there's like a number in between the F and the K, and you have this kind of like 200 millisecond delay, that it makes it really hard. And then once you get to like 500-600 milliseconds between the two of them, then you can start identifying the second one. And so this was something that was already kind of figured out in the attention literature. We've known about the attentional blink for a long time. And emotional researchers tried to use this paradigm and see whether or not emotion kind of influenced this idea. And so same idea, instead of numbers and letters, you now have these different images. You're telling them to focus on a specific kind of image. So in this case, you have these complex scenes. So ignore all the scenes and report to me ones that are different than that. What they found was that if the second target was emotionally salient, so this dog that's like really scary looking over here, that the attentional blink effect completely goes away. So it doesn't matter how close that dog is to the other one, you're still going to pay attention to it and you're still going to catch it. And so it kind of shows that there's kind of this increased awareness that somehow the amygdala is kind of priming these attention networks and enhancing the attention networks. And there's also been work that has shown that not only is it kind of priming the attention networks, but the amygdala itself can also do what some of these attention networks do, like we talked about in the attention lectures about boosting those signals in the sensory regions. There's some research that's showing the amygdala can directly do that for emotionally salient stimuli as well. So this is just a really nice example that it's not just memory that it's tied into, but with it being the most connected portion of the forebrain, it's really tied into all of these different cognitive processes. And so this was something that was just kind of interesting. I'll go through really quick. We've talked a lot about fear in this lecture. But these meta-analyses show that the amygdala is not just doing fear. It's kind of what this graph over here shows. And a lot of researchers are thinking that it's not necessarily fear that it's interested, but more interested in novelty, how important or new that stimuli is to our current behavior or goals or whatever. So it's mostly involved in fear. And that's something like its actual fear response is really heavy. Sorry, just want to make sure my wife's not in labor. All right. But they're also, and it's not just negative either, it's also active for these positive emotions too. And so it's kind of tied into things that are kind of arousing us in general, whether it's negative arousal or positive arousal. You have happiness, humor, and sex on here, all kind of get it going. And so there's a lot of researchers that think that it's really just tied into trying to determine what's important and what's new in the environment. And there are MRI studies that show, despite arousal or valence, it does light up for familiar versus novel. So it'll have a greater response for novel items than it does for familiar items, regardless of whether they were negative or positive or whether they produced arousal or not. So some nice evidence kind of pointing in that direction. This is very new research. It's kind of heading in that direction. Cool. So decision making. This picture was crazy. So this has been something that's been around for thousands of years. This idea that the emotional component of ourselves is separate from this rational component, and that they're kind of in competition with one another. And that really ties into decision making, which we'll get into next week. Let me see. Iowa gambling task. Wondering if we should skip some of the decision stuff in 10 minutes. We're going to do it in a little bit. So Iowa gambling task was something that showed that that people make very rash decisions if they're very emotional, and they tried to tie this to amygdala damage. So there were these 4 decks that they had to choose from. And they didn't know this, but 2 of the decks had kind of a net gain. And so overall, throughout the experiment, if you just chose cards from these 2 decks, you would end up having the most money at the end. And it was tied to like real money that they were giving these people. And so these decks would have low payouts. So the C and D, they had low payouts, but they would also have really low losses. Whereas the other ones, A and B, would have really high payouts, but really, really high losses as well. So if you were taking cards from A and B, you'd notice that you were losing a ton of your money a lot of the time. And so after a while, healthy participants will learn to stick to the decks that have the low payouts because they don't want to incur these really big losses. And this is something, I highlighted this one because we're going to talk a lot about orbital frontal cortex when we get into decision making. But they noticed that, and this is something that's really tied into the amygdala as well. We'll talk about how the amygdala is also involved in this on the next slide. But it was this idea that people with damage to the amygdala or the orbital frontal cortex, they didn't care if they were losing a ton of money, and they kept going for the big wins. And so they would stick to these really high risk type decks. And so this is this idea of loss aversion, that we don't, we're more concerned in not losing things than we are in gaining things. So we're kind of averse to losing, and that's what drives these people to pick the less risky decks. And what they found was that there's a lot more activity in the amygdala when we're losing things compared to when we're gaining things. And it could be this idea that the amygdala actually sees the loss of monetary type things as kind of something to be afraid of, and it's created that perception of something that's kind of uniquely human. And what we see is that patients with amygdala damage kind of show these reductions in the loss aversion. So even though they keep going through and losing and losing and losing, they don't really care, and they just keep doing it. And so that was this idea that the monetary loss is actually a threat, and it's been perceived as a threat. This is interesting. I'll go through this. So kind of along these lines of decision making, so we've shown that stress not only inhibits the hippocampus, but it also shuts down the prefrontal cortex, which is really heavily involved in maintaining our goals and kind of directing behavior that's not habitual, so like making choices and things like that. But while it's shutting down the frontal cortex, it's also strengthening the basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia, like we talked about in the action lecture, is really heavily tied to kind of habitual actions, things that we do all the time. And they did this study, and you see the opposite down here. So when we're in kind of an alert and safe environment, prefrontal cortex is really strong, and it's actually shutting down those habitual responses. We're making decisions. We're not just kind of going by our habits and things that we've done before. And so the study was done with these rats, where they would kind of stress them out while they were pushing this lever that got them food. And the rats that were not stressed ate until they were full and then stopped eating. But the rats that were heavily stressed would just keep eating and keep eating and keep eating. And it was just this habitual response. They didn't actually like regulate it. They didn't stop. And so it might be this evidence that when we're really stressed out, when we're in these like highly emotional states, that we revert to habitual choices. That we'll keep eating. We're sad and we just like go through a whole gallon of ice cream or something like that. Really kind of interesting kind of pathway that highlights how this might be happening. This was something that was really cool from the decision-making literature too. So this idea of the endowment effect is that if I have something that I want to sell, I think it's worth a lot more than someone's actually like willing to pay for it. That's what the endowment effect is. But what we see is that mood, emotion in general, kind of manipulates that whole idea. So if someone is sad, the entire effect is reversed. And so someone that's sad will actually like think that it's worth less than someone that's willing to pay for it. Really interesting. They kind of thought that this was this idea that if you're sad, you're in this unfavorable type situation, you're willing to just accept anything that'll get you out of it. So any kind of like monetary reward is going to make you happier. And then they found that disgust kind of led to a reduction in both prices. And so it was this idea that like, we want to get away from each other. Like, can we just get through this? Like, just give me whatever, like I'll take whatever. Really interesting idea that like, it's really tied into a lot of these decision-making processes and these appraisal processes. And a lot of that, so we talked a lot about the amygdala, but kind of the player behind a lot of this that really doesn't get a lot of credit is the insular cortex. And the insular cortex has been shown to be really, really heavily tied to these perceptions of bodily states. And it's really well situated, kind of right on the edge of the limbic system and right behind kind of the temporal cortex and the frontal cortex. That it is kind of believed to be the site where we're integrating all of those bodily feelings with the cognitive perceptions of them. And what we see is that it's involved in all of these other emotions that we haven't really talked about. And the reason why this isn't really heavily studied yet is because we're really just now starting to make headway into this field. And so we're using really advanced cognitive methods to try to like look at patterns and stuff within the insular cortex. And we have like 2 minutes left. I'm going to skip social cognition because we're going to talk about that in next week. So we have really high amygdala activity for fearful faces, and it's active for trustworthy and stuff. This was really interesting. So why can't why can she recognize all these other emotions but not fear? And this was kind of looking at how we use the whites of the eyes to do fear. And people with amygdala damage don't look at people's eyes, which is really interesting. I'll try to tie some of these slides back into things. I wanted to get to this. So the amygdala is really heavily active when we're categorizing people into groups. And this is something that's really, really helpful if we're making judgments about whether or not we should trust someone, whether we should approach someone. But this is something that, when not checked, can kind of lead to this racial stereotyping idea, right? And there was this really cool group out of Harvard that put together this implicit association test that was trying to measure these kind of inherent biases that we have, that we're, even if we don't think that we're racially stereotyping people, that there's kind of this stuff in the background that's automatically doing it. And so you start out here where you see words and you're told to categorize them as good or bad. And then you're shown faces, and you're told to categorize them into whatever the category is. So in this case, African American and European Americans, could be old and young, whichever kind of bias you're trying to test. And then halfway through the experiment, and this goes really fast, so it's something that you're just kind of doing on the fly, they put both labels up, but you're only making one decision. And so people end up making mistakes. So right here, the left button is either African American or bad, and the right button is either European American or good. So on this one, you're supposed to be making a judgment about whether he's African American or European American, but sometimes people implicitly like link these faces to either bad or good. And when they make those mistakes, it kind of reveals that there's kind of some implicit bias that may be behind these things. So they did this study in the MRI, and they showed that they had white participants in here while they were doing white and black faces and going through they did the IAT beforehand. And they showed that the amygdala was really heavily active for unfamiliar black faces. And it was when there were celebrities on the screen, it wasn't, they were like, I know that person, that's trustworthy, whatever. And they showed that the magnitude, so the amount of amygdala activity, was linked to their score on the IAT. And so if they had really heavy implicit bias, they had really high amygdala activity for those faces. Interesting. They also did the same study, but they showed the faces either really quickly or for a long time. And this is evidence for that low and high roads that we talked about earlier. The amygdala was really heavily active for quick trials and unfamiliar black faces, but not significantly active on long trials where it was more cortical stuff that was like figuring that stuff out. So it was kind of these really quick decisions that we were coming to that were driven by the amygdala. But if we had time to really think about it, then we would start to see kind of more activity in these cortical regions. So that's what I got for you guys today.